Hey everyone, this is Derrick Broze with the Conscious Resistance Network, and today we're going to continue our conversation, our dialogue about borders and immigration, and specifically, what is the correct, proper, philosophical libertarian position to take when it relates to the state's role, the government's role in borders and in the free flow of movement or immigration. Now, the reason I'm discussing this, and specifically from a libertarian viewpoint, is because for those who followed my work for however many years, you know that I used to be very involved in the libertarian movement. The first time I ever spoke publicly was in 2013 at a libertarian anarchist conference in New York City called Anarchy in the NYC. And there was a lot of well-known libertarians there. That was my first public speaking, and I was a bit nervous. You can find that at theconsciousresistance.com, by the way, under our presentations. Prior to that, back in Houston, where I'm originally from, I had been involved with the End the Fed movement out there. Although I didn't campaign for Republican presidential candidate Ron Paul, the movement that he helped inspire and create, which was really just the latest version of the movement that had been going for hundreds of years, and most recently in the 60s with Murray Rothbard and Carl Hess and Samuel Konkin, people that went on to inspire folks like Ron Paul. I've been involved in this. I spoke at the Texas Libertarian Party Convention, I think in 2016. Even recently when I ran for mayor of Houston, I was endorsed by the Harris County Libertarian Party. So although I don't explicitly talk about libertarianism all the time, if you've read my book, specifically the Conscious Resistance Trilogy, you know that it is all about voluntarism and libertarianism, and even my book, How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State, is all about agorism, which is a part of that movement of voluntarist philosophical thought, libertarian, anarchist philosophical thought. So this has been very intrinsic in my work, even if it's something I don't talk about all the time. Now, I want to address one thing first before we get into focusing on the libertarian aspect. I know there are going to be some of you out there who don't care about libertarianism, don't get it, maybe don't understand it yet. So part of this is going to be a little bit of education to help you see what libertarians think about borders and immigration, and how we can come to a place to find the correct freedom or libertarian position. And for those of you who, again, don't care about this, you're just going to have maybe some emotional reaction and say, well, bad people are coming in from other countries, military-age males, it's the Chinese, it's Hamas, there's all kinds of theories going on, and they're invading us through the southern border. That's fine. Hold those positions if you want, but at least hopefully you'll recognize that the U.S. foreign policy is playing a role in these people's decisions. I actually live in Mexico. I'm in Mexico right now. I live between Mexico and Texas, and I never see anything relating to the border. Of course, I don't live on the border. In Texas, I live 5 hours from the border. In Mexico, I live 12 hours from the border. But nevertheless, even though I'm living on both sides of this border, I never really see much of the hubbub that's going on. Nevertheless, though, let's go ahead and get into this. Let's talk about this whole situation. And I'm going to specifically be focusing on this recent debate, conversation with Dave Smith and Austrian economist Robert Murphy, who I've actually met over the years at these various libertarian events. I've had some dinners and sit-downs. I doubt Bob remembers me, but we've seen each other, we've known each other over the years. And he hosts the Mises podcast, the Human Action podcast. And it's titled, Does Libertarianism Require Support for Open Borders? And I want to make that clear as well from the beginning. I'm not advocating for open borders, which is hopefully going to become more clear as we progress through this. So this came out in late February. I watched it a couple weeks ago. I downloaded it. I listened to the entire thing. I took notes. As you can see here, I have a lot of notes, timestamps, and I tried to focus on the most particular points. What I'm going to do today is to cover our areas of agreement where I think that myself and Dave Smith are seeing the same thing, and then get to some points of contention where I think that he's totally wrong, or at least headed in the wrong direction as far as libertarianism is concerned. And then finally, I will talk about my viewpoints, what I've written, what I've talked about in terms of borders and immigration. We're going to try to keep this under 30 minutes, so let's go ahead and dive in. First things first, though, I want to remind you guys to bookmark and sign up for my email newsletter at theconsciousresistance.com. This is where I've been producing all of my content for 10 years now, since 2013. This is my website with my documentaries, my books, my podcasts, interviews, video reports, etc. If you want to support us, you can go to theconsciousresistance.com/invest. You can also go to our shop and buy some of my books or buy some of our shirts, and that's another great way to support us. So, as I mentioned, this is all about this recent podcast, Does Libertarianism Require Support for Open Borders? I've got my notes. Let's go ahead and dive in. So, how does the immigration debate relate to how libertarians should feel about so-called public property? What does public property typically mean? In our current world, it means property that is controlled by the government. And the idea here is that we, the people, are this collective known as the public, and the government is just taking care of it through our tax dollars and like taking care of quote unquote public parks, and whether that's your local park or a state park or a national park. And those are generally seen as things that are accessible to all people. But for us as libertarians, since we think that the whole problem is the fact that the government is in control of things, and we see that the so-called public property is not legitimate, that and this is where the sort of division and the discussion happens. There are some libertarians who say that this so-called public property, if we were to move into a world, a truly libertarian world, an anarchist world, it would become unowned. It would become just basically available to anybody who could go out there now and homestead it and claim it for their own. Others argue that it is the net taxpayers, those who've been living in the United States and paying taxes, that they would then have some claim to that formerly public property, and how you divide that up and how that works is a whole other area of debate. Now, for those who understand the history of libertarianism, specifically the last 50 years or so, you know that Murray Rothbard, the economist, philosopher, historian, is a monumental figure and has played a major role. And so Rothbard, his position evolved over time, several different times in fact. So I'm going to read a couple of quotes from Rothbard so we can get a little bit of a picture, because much of what Dave is arguing from is from Rothbard, as well as his student Hans Hermann Hoppe, their position on immigration. So here's Rothbard in his book, Man, Economy, and State. He says the libertarian society would resolve the entire immigration question within the matrix of absolute property rights. For people only have the right to move to those properties and lands where the owners desire to rent or sell to them. In a free society, they would, in first instance, have the right to travel only to those streets whose owners agree to have them there, and then to rent or buy housing from willing owners. Again, just as in the case of daily movements on streets, a diverse and varying pattern of access of immigration would indubitably arise. And I agree with that there would be diverse and different patterns of types of access and types of immigration. Now, one of the most often cited evidence for Rothbard's later further shift on immigration is an article titled Nations by Consent, which was written in the fall of 1994, very shortly before Rothbard died. And it's in this article that he starts to consider the reemergence of what he says as a nation compared to a nation state. And what he means by that is this is like a piece of land governed by a government that is based on national cultural values. And so he started to see that the Soviet Union was sending immigrants into their former controlled states that they were in charge of. And Rothbard started to notice that this might actually change the demographics of the area. He says, quote, I raise the pure anarcho-capitalist model in this paper, not so much to advocate the model per se as to propose it as a guide for setting vexed current disputes about nationality. The pure model simply is that no land areas, no square footage in the world shall remain public. Every square foot of land area, be they streets, squares, or neighborhoods, is privatized. Total privatization would help solve nationality problems, often in surprising ways, and I suggest that existing states and classical liberal states try to approach such a system even while some land areas remain in the governmental sphere. So that's kind of the Rothbardian libertarian position. Here's the article. It's known as Nations by Consent. It was published in the Journal for Libertarian Studies. As I said, it was written in 1994, shortly before Rothbard died. And as we'll get into in a little bit, I actually discussed this whole this article here recently in an interview that I did with Jeffrey Tucker, asking, were libertarians wrong about immigration? And this is where Jeffrey actually brought up this essay. We did this just a couple of months ago in January, and he was saying this has kind of caused him to rethink some of his previous positions about immigration borders. So this is something that I've been contemplating and considering as well. This is why I take this topic very seriously, and I took the time to go through Dave's interview with Bob and actually try to dissect it. So let's see where we agree. And I have timestamps here. I might mention those. So if anybody wants, I'm not going to play the clips from it because it's just too tedious, because there's a lot I'm going to go through. But if you hear me do the timestamps, that's your reference point. You can go look this up in the discussion with Dave and Bob Murphy does libertarianism require support for open borders? And again, I'll say I'm not calling for open borders. So first of all, we agree on the need to talk about this. At 10 minutes and 30 seconds, Dave says, why do we talk about this? And he mentions that libertarians have always talked about what's the second or third best option. We should discuss what's possible at the moment. And this is the reality check that we all need, that we are not living in a perfect libertarian or anarchist world, and we probably will not get there in our lifetimes. I'm skeptically optimistic. I believe we can do so in small groups, in intentional communities, eco-villages, enclaves, but I don't think we're going to see a society. So if we understand that, we can still try to, I mean, the best thing I think is to live as a libertarian, not to just think in terms of theory, but if you're actually going to try to get to this world, then you need to live it and be an example for it, and that's what I try to do. But at the same time, if we're going to talk about anything philosophical and we acknowledge we're not living in our perfect world, then we should probably try to figure out what is the second or third best option. And that's what Dave has said he's trying to do. Dave also mentioned that he's speaking to the remnant. This is a term that's often used in libertarianism, this idea that we're speaking to the people who actually get it. He's trying to, those people who remain and who are there, who are potentially reachable. He's trying to persuade as much people as possible. Again, this is something that I'm doing with my work, with my books, with my speaking, my advocacy. I agree with that, Dave. I think we should consider second and third best options. I think we should still try to speak to the people and get the message out there. He says at 22:30, if we really care about these ideas, then how do we marry these ideas to reality? Otherwise, then what is this? It's just a thought experiment. And I agree. This has been my problem with libertarianism for a long time. I mean, I wrote a bunch of philosophy and theory in the Conscious Resistance trilogy, particularly the third book, Manifesto of the Free Humans, about my ideal vision and what I'm going to build an intentional community. I'm actually building it here in Mexico based on the values and principles I wrote in that book. But I wrote with the full understanding that this is likely not going to lead to a world full of libertarians. But I know that it's important to put the ideas out there. We can't just be speaking philosophically, theoretically, hypothetically all the time and expecting the average person to make some sort of tangible connection to it and all of a sudden decide, wow, these really abstract ideas are so great, I need to live them in my life. Dave says that his main goal is to bring libertarianism to the masses, so you need to grapple with the real world scenarios, keep plan A, and push people towards that real goal. Keep promoting the philosophy, but deal with reality. Again, Dave, I agree with you wholeheartedly. He said this about an hour and 28 minutes into his discussion with Bob. Now, those are the things we agree on, which, as you can see, is mainly sort of strategic, philosophical points that we should discuss the second and third best option. We need to deal with reality and keep focusing on the bigger picture and what we're fighting for, the perfect libertarian world, but also accept the reality as it is. And I'm with you on that. Now, this is where we come to our fundamental disagreements. And as I go through these, I will be popping up some various links. I'm going to be quoting from Hans Hermann Hoppe, from Lou Rockwell, from David Friedman, myself, and plenty of other people. So hang on. So, one, is property currently held by the government considered unowned, in a state of nature, ready to be reclaimed or homesteaded? Or should it be considered the property of the current taxpayers? This is sort of one of the major cruxes of this discussion. There's going to be a few more, but this is a major point here. As I started earlier, this discussion about whether or not the property should be unowned, and let's say like you have a national park and the government collapses or gets abolished or something happens, and within moments people declare all formerly held government property is now unowned. Whoever can homestead it and get to it without, coercion and force and fraud and all the typical libertarian values under the non-aggression principle, that is your property, do what you will with it. Whereas others say, no, we need some system that's going to determine, maybe using AI or something, how much piece of property each net taxpayer gets. And the funny thing is, maybe if formerly public property became no longer public property in the terms of government-owned property, we would end up still leaving it as it is. I mean, I could imagine a scenario where, let's say you have a national park and you do the math of how many net taxpayers now co-own the land, and that ends up being like millions of people are going to get like a little inch of the land. Instead, the people might decide, you know what, let's just keep it in this quote-unquote public state where we all get to have access to it. I think that's one potential, that in a truly libertarian world, we are going to have a mix. This is my main argument. You're going to have a mixed use case of all types of different property. You could have obviously private property, private homes and neighborhoods and things like that, but there will be other spaces that we might use the term public or unowned or collectively owned or shared or whatever terms you want to use. I think that's the real libertarian future. At 34 minutes, Dave doubts, he says, because the government is controlling controlling it, there should be no restrictions and it should be treated like unowned property. So Dave doubts that idea, like just because the government's controlling it and we should just say there should be no restrictions. And he gives a few different examples of like, you know, so should somebody be allowed to shoot up heroin on public schools because, well, you know, let's not put any restrictions, or should somebody be allowed to shoot up on the corners of San Francisco in the in that what is it called? What's the district? I was just there recently in San Francisco, and I'll tell you what. Look, even though I'm a libertarian and I support open, you know, you put what you want in your body, it is definitely disturbing to go to a place like that where there's just drugs being openly used. There's human feces everywhere, and I wouldn't argue, well, that's government property, it's public, technically I own that, that's okay. So I get where Dave's going with this. Dave said it doesn't follow from that because it's stolen, it belongs to the world. I get that argument. I think that there's something to be said there. Dave says libertarian theory would follow that stolen property should be returned to you. And that is a reasonable argument. And again, this gets difficult though when we start trying to decide who gets what out of all the various taxpayers. And my other point that I've brought up often whenever people say this whole thing about taxpayers, what about those folks like some of us we know who don't pay taxes? What about the agorists? What about the counter-economists who purposefully advocate for not paying taxes and for tax avoidance and tax resistance? Because they understand that this is the moral position. This is in fact what Samuel Konkin, who is a libertarian by all accounts, has advocated during his life. This is what I advocate for. And so I wonder, Dave and others who advocate for this net taxpayer position, would you say then the agorists and the counter-economists who don't pay taxes and who are resisting because they see it as immoral, when this situation happens, they have no claim? Is that the argument you would make? And I'm not putting words in your mouth. I genuinely want to know. Because if so, that doesn't seem fair either. That doesn't seem libertarian either. Because let's say the agorist, the person who is willing to take the risk and understands and says, you know what, the only way to get to a libertarian society is to consistently apply libertarian principles. This is what Samuel Konkin said. And to me, paying taxes is immoral, so I'm not going to participate in that system. And you decide not to, but then you're later punished if the state is abolished or if we get to a libertarian world. Well, sorry, you didn't pay taxes, so you have no claims over any of these pieces of land that were formerly public property. That doesn't seem right either. I don't know what the perfect solution is in that case, but it seems like something we need to rectify. 53 minutes, Dave says, conclusions, we need some reasonable conclusions on restrictions on public property. I agree with that. I don't know exactly what the perfect restrictions are other than to say in private communities, people would set their own restrictions of what you can and can't do on their land, on the shared spaces. For example, as I mentioned, we have 23 acres here in Mexico. There's a small group of us. We're building our land project, The Conscious Agora, theconsciousagora.com if you want to learn more about our libertarian project. Non-aggression principle is one of our key values. And we each have our, let's say, 1.5 acres, 2 acres to our own, that we can do whatever the heck we want. We can grow whatever food we want. You can, you know, plant whatever you want, build whatever type of house you want on that space. But that's also part of this larger 23-acre property that we have all agreed is going to essentially be collectively owned, shared, unowned, whatever terminology you want to use. We don't really think about it too hard. We just know that the fruit trees that are outside of my particular 2 acres that I own, and this is my private property, I still have access to that. I still have access to the water, to the springs. And this is just the agreement that our community came to. Instead of sort of making it super restrictive that you have to build your house right next to the trees and you can claim all those trees, now they're your own. We decided, let's create a village. You get your own space, you get your own acreage, and that's it. You own it, and you can do whatever you want in that space, on your dinner plate, in your house, etc. And in the rest of the land, we have some, you know, basic agreements of societal norms. And anybody coming into our community would, of course, have to abide by those norms or be asked to leave or eventually be physically removed from the property. So I totally get this idea of setting norms based on private property, obviously as a libertarian, but I also think that we can have this kind of mixed use space where you have private property with quote unquote public, unowned, shared, etc., collective property. So second big point of contention, Bob said at one point, what principles do we use to determine what the government should do? Is it just to best guess if it were privately held what people would do? And so he's trying to ask Dave, and I think this is again an important discussion to have, that how do we determine the best moves? How do we go forward? Since we're not living in a libertarian world and we know we're probably not going to get there anytime soon, how do we evaluate what's the best position to take? I think what Bob suggested, to say what's the best guess of what we would do if the land was privately held. Now again, as it's going to become clear as we go through this, I don't believe in full-on privatization of everything. That might be where I differ from some of these libertarians, and that's sometimes why I even get labeled a left libertarian, although I don't necessarily wear that label. Dave said libertarians are against democracy in the sense that we don't think other people should be able to vote and decide what other people do with their bodies, property, and rights. I agree with that. He says, I do think at least an element should be, what do the people want? Now, this is where I think we get into some collectivist arguments. Dave starts talking about, well, if you do polls show that the average person is against open borders, that they want some sort of closed border, regulated situation. So we as libertarians should consider, what does the collective want? What does the people want? And this gets into a whole other area about, libertarians, we don't believe in democracy because we don't believe in some collective will of the people. We believe in individuals' rights, individual choices, individual statements and methods and things like that. So to me, I don't know that we should be taking some sort of collectivist approach and saying, well, what does the will of the people, what do they want? And let's go with that, because what if the will of the people, as we know, as the tyranny of the majority, is often very wrong, and we're just supposed to go along with that because that's what the collective want? I don't think that's a libertarian position. Dave says, I think the standard might be what's closest to private property, what's reasonable, and what's in the best interest of libertarian future. That I can agree with. Like, how do we get to that point closest to private property? Again, not full-on privatization is what I'm calling for. What's reasonable? Now, of course, that's very subjective. And what's in the best interest of libertarian future? Again, very subjective, but generally speaking, I would agree with those statements. Number 3, another crux of this debate comes down to definitions of open borders versus closed borders. And I'm going to come back to this point a few different times because I think this is really the problem. This is the issue that we're having, is that people are using terms open borders, and when people hear that, they literally think like an open door, anybody can walk through it. And in closed borders is like the doors are closed and tightly regulated, and you got a system of bringing in people. But that's not always true. Open borders doesn't just inherently mean the door's open and anybody can come in. It's a little bit more complex than that. And in my position, I think we should sort of, as libertarians at least, try to abandon these terms because they're still coming from this statist mentality of the government is essentially controlling. Because if it's an open border situation, it's the government, quote unquote, doing nothing, but they're still the ones in charge. We're still dealing in terms of the imperfect statist situation that we're living in. And I know we need to deal with reality, but I don't think using these terms, especially when we're talking with libertarians, other libertarians, we need to get to some new terminology. I suggest things like decentralized borders, things like that. But that's really the crux of this, is what is your definition of open borders and closed borders? Much like a couple of moments ago I said, the other fundamental disagreement is, what is unknown property? What does that even mean? Is that a thing? And what happens to public property if the government no longer exists? So at an hour and 13 minutes, Dave says, to make an argument that all things being the same, we just open the borders now, that would be a disaster. The Cato guys, he's talking about the Cato Institute, make the consequentialist arguments that immigration would be a net positive. And they do make that argument, and this is where we're going to start to get into some more of these disagreements. This is where Dave starts to recommend the Hans Hermann Hoppe position about invitation, that people should only be able to come with some sort of invitation from a job, from an employee. And I tend to agree with this idea here. It's the details where we diverge. But at an hour and 14 minutes, Dave says, a person who invites someone has to be liable for all the costs of the invitee. He says there is a problem with the argument that if you have a job waiting, you are invited. And again, this is coming from the Hans Hermann Hoppe position. So Dave is saying that even if you get a job invite, that job waiting for you, that technically doesn't count as an invite. And I totally disagree with that. But let's go in to see what exactly Hans Hermann Hoppe has said. And I have the links here where I'm quoting him. I'm quoting him from an essay by Lou Rockwell called Open Borders Are an Assault on Private Property, where he's quoting him directly from his writing. And he says here, Hans Hermann Hoppe says, quote, equipped with a work permit, the immigrant is allowed to make use of every public facility, roads, parks, hospitals, schools, and no landlord, businessman, or private associate is permitted to discriminate against him as regards housing, employment, accommodation, and association. That is, the immigrant comes invited with a substantial fringe benefits package paid for not or only partially by the immigrant employer who allegedly has extended the invitation. but by other domestic proprietors as taxpayers who had no say in the invitation whatsoever. He said that he believes this because, quote, the employer does not assume the full cost associated with his new employee. The employer partially externalizes the cost of that employee on the tax-paying public. This is where I have an issue. I think that this is, again, it's kind of a collectivist argument. I get it on one level, that the idea that if somebody comes here, just because I say, hey, I got a job for you, I want to put you up in my farm and let you, work the fields, or I need a new cook in the kitchen and I'm not going to ask about your immigration status, come on down, you got a job. That means they have been invited, I would say, technically, and they're going to have a job, they're going to be paying, so that means you would assume they can get an apartment, they can get a house, they can take care of themselves. They're not going to be weighing down the public. And this is the major concern that libertarians, and I think more right libertarians and conservatives have, is that these immigrants are just going to be a drain on society and things like that. And these are mainly conservative talking points, I would say. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't matter at all, but I think these mainly are conservative talking points. I wouldn't see these as strictly libertarian talking points, even though people think Hans Hermann Hoppe is the greatest thing since sliced bread. I don't think he's correct here. I don't think that because somebody can't afford the cost of their entire life when they show up, that they shouldn't be allowed into the country. I mean, I think that's just an insane idea, Dave, to say that like a hardworking Mexican or somebody from further south or Africa or wherever they may come, they go through the trouble to come to the United States, and because they can't automatically account for how they're going to take care of every one of their needs and make sure that they don't ever have to use a public hospital, or make sure that they don't have to go on welfare for a period of time while they get on their feet, that because of that, they should never be allowed to come. That just seems very ridiculous, seems anti-libertarian, anti-freedom, anti-individual liberty for sure. So again, my question is, so because people who hire them can't afford to cover the cost of their entire life, they should never be allowed into the country? Seems a little ridiculous. And the statement was, these are not true invitations by libertarian standards. At an hour and 21 minutes, Bob says that Hoppians should emphasize this invitation system. He said, quote, if there are hundreds of millions of people around the world who would really be contributors fiscally to the U.S. jurisdiction if they come in, they should be for the Hoppian approach. Basically saying, like, look, if you are going to be a net positive, you should support this idea of an invitation. But again, how can you cover all your bases? There's no way that a person, especially if they're struggling, they're running away from U.S. foreign policy, or they're running away from drug war, from cartels and stuff like that, could ever just start this arduous journey and show up with the expectation that they're going to have all of these things mapped out and know exactly how they're going to take care of their health care. They're not going to put their kids in the schools because that's being funded by taxpayers, and apparently that's a bad thing. Even though we as libertarians reject the public schooling system in the first place. Instead, I think what would be a more appropriate approach, and this is something I write about in my essay, The Revolutionary Potential of quote-unquote illegal immigrants, is that there is like a libertarian welcome squad that is actually trying to integrate and collaborate with the immigrants that are coming from different places and help them understand, for example, libertarian philosophy, the counter economy. Don't get your papers, don't get your permits. There's strength outside of the systems. Let's work with you. Let's do mutual aid. That's what libertarianism means to me. I think some of you guys just want libertarianism so you can live in nice suburban neighborhoods, gated communities, and never leave anywhere and be afraid of the outside world. And I guess technically that's a version of libertarianism, but that's not what I'm arguing for. I'm talking about mutual aid, coming together, building community based on individual liberty, and helping those where we can. Now, Rockwell, he makes a statement here back in this essay, Open Borders Are an Assault on Private Property. He says, what we are witnessing are examples of a subsidized movement. Libertarians defending these mass migrations as if they were market phenomena are only helping to discredit and undermine the true free market. And I think that's an interesting statement. He's saying subsidized movement, and what he means by that is because the Democrats or the government saying, hey, come on over, we got all you can need, you're going to be able to vote, you're going to get a house, we're going to give you asylum. And the taxpayers are the ones bearing the costs, of course, that this is subsidized by the government. That is true to some degree. The government is subsidizing and encouraging people to come over. They have been doing less so. Mexican government's telling people not to come. The U.S. government is discouraging people to come more recently. That doesn't mean there's not a border that's open and that people are coming across. So I get the argument here that this is actually subsidized by the government and that we should be against it. I just don't think inherently we should take a collectivist one-size-fits-all approach and say, well, everybody who's going to come then under this subsidized by the government movement is inherently going to be a net negative. And also, the flip side, we shouldn't assume that they're going to be a net positive as well, and just assume that all immigrants that are coming are here to do great things and they love America and they're going to do good things. Some people truly do just want to come live off the welfare system. One other question I have that I didn't get a chance to get into is this question, which got brought up many times, about hospital bills, saying that whenever immigrants come over and they have to use the hospital, and they don't pay the bills, they use fake names, which honestly, a lot of people do that. Americans do that, so it's not just immigrants, but that these costs get factored into hospital bills and insurance rates. I didn't do that research yet, but if you have anything on that, I would like to prove or debunk that. Is it true that people who don't pay bills at the hospital, they affect the insurance rates of other people, they affect the cost of hospital bills? I don't know if that's true. I think the hospitals can afford to treat some people for free, every now and then, and things are going to be okay. And I don't think that should be cost on to the cost should be passed on to the taxpayer, of course. I'm just saying I don't know if that's 100% accurate. Now, here's another argument I want to bring in. This is from David Friedman, Austrian economist. He's actually more of the Chicago school, but he's a libertarian economist, and he wrote this essay just recently, April 14th, A Libertarian Argument, literally just in the last couple days, about immigration. And here he says, quote, "It is not an absurd argument, but the notion of indirect liability that it depends on has implications that I do not think either Hoppe or his supporters would accept. If I sell you a gun, I'm an indirect cause of any crimes you commit with it. Should I be permitted to do it so only if I agree to be liable for the cost of such crimes? If I sell you a car, the normal legal rule in a free society is that individuals are responsible for their own offenses. There is no obvious reason why this rule for immigrants should be different." Again, this is to me is a huge point, a blind spot in Dave's argument. If we believe in personal responsibility, individual responsibility, which is absolutely a libertarian ethic, then why don't we apply that to all people? I don't think it just applies to U.S. citizens or people who are born here on this side of the river or this side of the mountain or whatever. I think that's an ethic that libertarians try to apply across the board for all human beings, that we need to take personal responsibility for our actions. And so that means if an individual comes and they commit crimes or they end up being a net negative on the taxpayers, that is their responsibility, not the responsibility of their boss or their would-be boss. So then David Friedman also says, Hoppe's proposal also makes little sense in other ways. Unless he intends immigrants to function like slaves or indentured servants, working for a single employer or those he lends them out to, they will be engaged, like other people, in a multitude of voluntary transactions with lots of different people. It makes no sense for all of those transactions to hinge on the permission of a single sponsor who could withdraw that permission anytime he chose, or, if he cannot, is liable for acts over which he has no control. So again, I mean, this is just silly. Like the idea that, okay, so you got a job, you've been invited to do that, but you can't touch any other piece of land because nobody invited you to drive on the freeway, nobody invited you to use the school system, nobody invited you to use the hospital. So somehow if you can manage to get over the border and get to my job, I will give you a job and you can work here. But then once those 8-hour shifts are over, you got to figure out where you're going to stay and how you're going to get there, because you can't use the roads, you can't use any of this stuff. And if you ever do anything bad, I'm responsible. It makes no sense. It totally goes against libertarian ethics of personal responsibility. All right, number 5, at 1:19, Dave concedes that this is not a perfect situation regarding the current immigration process. And I agree. I think this is, I'm fully admitting this is not a perfect situation. I understand we're working on second or third best here. But my questions here are, how do you measure the impact of an immigrant, Dave? You said that it's not true that immigrants contribute more than they take, which is what Cato and some others have argued and different data out there claims. But how do you know that? I mean, I haven't looked at all the studies that claim that immigrants contribute more than they take or that they're a net positive more than a net negative. But how are you measuring the impact of an immigrant? Personally, I think people are more valuable than just their fiscal or financial contribution. So I tend to value people based on individuals and what they are and what they present. That doesn't mean that every single person crossing the border is going to be a good person, just like every single American isn't a good person. But you know what? They're here, they're born, so they exist and they have rights, and that just is what it is. And people are more than what they have in their wallets or in their bank accounts. People who are born in the U.S. and are poor, as I said a moment ago, those people are using hospitals without paying. They're getting education from the public system. Are they wrong? Should they be physically removed for not contributing? And maybe the answer is yes. You would say in a libertarian society, these undesirables, as Hoppe likes to say, or these people who are not contributing anything will be physically removed from our communities. And it starts to just, I think, evolve into some kind of tyranny eventually. It was like, well, you're not doing enough. You're not good enough. You're not worth enough. Instead of recognizing that people are beautiful, powerful, free, sovereign individuals, and they are inherently endowed with these rights from their creator, they have value, they have worth. That doesn't mean that they recognize their value or their worth, or that they're currently contributing something worthy. But in general, humans have value just because they exist. I don't think we should be basing people's value just off their financial contributions or lack thereof. Okay, sixth point. At 1 hour and 33, Bob asked Dave about his appearance on Clint's podcast. And this was, I think it's called the Lockdown Podcast. I honestly don't know this guy. He's Clint. He seems to be blowing up pretty well recently. And it was on this podcast where there was clips of Dave going around. I'm sure you've seen them. If not, you can find them, saying, yes, I want to put the entire fucking military on the border. That is my position. We need to bring the troops home, put them on the border. Dave claims that he's just picking up Ron Paul's position. We should bring the empire home. And he said, if you see that as growth of the state, fine. I do see that as growth of the state. I don't understand why this is so confusing to people. The military is a branch of the U.S. government, which is the head of the U.S. government. The chief of the military is the U.S. president. This is part of the state, part of the government. And if we bring the troops home from wherever they're at, or just bring them from bases in the U.S. and put them on the border, that is growing the state. Now, technically, you're just rearranging the state, right? You didn't necessarily grow it from what it already was, but in terms of what a job you're giving those soldiers to do, you're making them more invasive, more in our face. And if you know anything about the border, Dave, or Texas, or this constitution-free border zone that they have all around the United States, there are dozens and dozens of cities, probably hundreds at this point, cities and towns that are living within these so-called constitution-free zones. If you're near the border in Texas, you see Border Patrol everywhere. You see the Department of Homeland Security everywhere. So in addition to your local cops trying to harass you, you also see the federal government police state there. And I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think bringing more troops there is the answer. Bob says if the answer is to keep the troops across the world because we are afraid of them oppressing us, it's not an answer. I get that. I'm not saying, yeah, let's leave them in Africa and Iraq and other places because let's let them oppress other people. I'm not saying that's the perfect answer either. How about just bring them home and let them sit in the bases and chill and do nothing until they're needed? They don't necessarily need to go straight to the border. At 1 hour and 41, Dave says, he starts talking about unintended consequences, and he talks about if secession leads to state authoritarianism, then we would oppose that as libertarians. So, we're for secession. So let's say we do that because it shrinks the federal government from centralized power down to a little bit more local. But then we realize, oh shoot, one of these state governments is just as tyrannical or maybe even worse than the federal government. And then we try to shrink it further and we oppose it. I get that. Look, we can argue for imperfect solutions and still say, if that goes wrong, I'm going to be against it. And I appreciate that Dave acknowledged that. At 141, he said, Dave acknowledges there might be other problems. He says, then we start opposing them. So if they have a militarized zone, there will be rights violations. We should always oppose that, right? So if he says, let's bring the troops home, put them on the border to try to fix the situation. If it turns into some militarized zone where the border is no longer safe and people living there are just having rights violated all the time, then Dave acknowledges, okay, well then we would oppose that. And I get that. But for me, it seems like we can predict that's probably going to go bad. I'm not saying, again, do nothing, open borders, do nothing, and just let whatever happen. I'm getting to what I believe, but I don't think militarizing the border, and I do see that as militarizing the border is the solution. And here's another point from David Freeman. He says, quote, the third line of argument is that as long as some property is owned by the government is entitled to control its use. As Dave Smith points out, an adult man does not have the right to go into the girls' room of a public school. Government property is not and should not be commons. Hence, the government may, if it chooses, refuse to allow immigrants it has not approved to allow to use public property. Since public property includes almost the entire highway system, this makes it hard for an immigrant not approved by the government to do anything in the country much beyond employment and a farm on the border. This is what I was saying earlier. So if somebody gets invited for a job, but you're claiming they can't make use of any of the other systems, how are they even going to get around? And if roads were private, the owners might require some form of driver's license in order to make the roads safer. If the roads are public, it is not unreasonable for them to require a driver's license and refuse to allow an immigrant without one to drive. But that does not justify forbidding a legal driver from carrying the immigrant. What Smith's argument is proposing is that the government using its control over public property not to serve the purposes of that property, but to prevent voluntary transactions between its citizens and foreigners. I agree. I think, Dave, you're calling for more state control, because if I hire an immigrant and I go pick them up at the border, or I fly them, I pay for their flight so they're not incurring any additional costs, bring them here, I send them money so they have cash to get food, and then every day when their shift ends, I drive them back across the border, and we do that whole silly thing until they have enough money to buy their own home, and then I, as a actual quote-unquote citizen, help facilitate that. Am I in violation? Not only does that just sound silly and ridiculous, but I'm just wondering, like, are other free people allowed to help individuals, or is that still somehow violating libertarian norms? I don't think so. Now, here's some other points I came up with, or that I thought about. Hypothetically, so this is something Dave said. He said, hypothetically, if there was a law that said only libertarians could vote in the next 5 elections, I'd support that. I know that's not practical, and I know it's not going to happen, but I would support that. Now, again, this is a hypothetical, so don't just get all triggered, Dave, or anybody who happens to hear this, but I think this is a huge red flag. This would violate the rights of millions of people and what they want. Using the state as a tool against our enemies in the same way they have against us is not the answer. You can't force people to be free, especially not by voting. So although that's a hypothetical, Dave, but if you would vote to say that, okay, well, only people who believe like me can vote in the next 5 elections, that is oppressive, that is tyrannical, that is not libertarian, that is not freedom. And so if that hypothetical ever happened, and the fact that you say you would do it because you think, well, other libertarians are going to think like me, and we're going to do the best thing for the future, so let's just cut the status out, and somehow that'll lead to libertarianism. We'll force it on them. But as Samuel Konkin so eloquently and presciently said, you can't use statist means to get to libertarian ends. Like, we have to stay consistent. And so now this gets me to my position. We're going 40 minutes in. I apologize, guys, but I hope you find this interesting. We're almost done. We're now on my positions of how I feel about this whole situation. As I mentioned, I did this interview with Jeffrey Tucker earlier this year. Were libertarians wrong about immigration? And Jeffrey actually was referencing this Nations by Consent article, essay by Rothbard, and that did cause me to think about my position. That's why I named it the interview, Were Libertarians Wrong About Immigration? And then, more recently I came across Dave Smith debating people about this, and I definitely think that this is an ongoing issue. This is not going to stop being debated about in libertarian circles, but it's just popping back up right now because it's a really important issue right now. Now, I want to go back to the question to Nations of Consent by Rothbard, because I think he wrote some interesting things here. And then I'm going to quote from my own book, my essay, The Revolutionary Potential of Illegal Immigrants. So here's Rothbard in Nations by Consent. The question of open borders or free immigration has become an accelerating problem for classical liberals. This is first because the welfare state increasingly subsidizes immigrants to enter and receive permanent assistance, which is what we talked about earlier. And second, because cultural boundaries have become increasingly swamped. I began to rethink my views on immigration when, as the Soviet Union collapsed, it became clear that ethnic Russians have been encouraged to flood into Estonia and Latvia in order to destroy the cultures and languages of these people. Previously, it had been easy to dismiss as unrealistic Jean Raspail's anti-immigration novel, The Camp of the Saints, in which virtually the entire population of India decides to move in small boats into France, and the French, infected by liberal ideology, cannot summon the will to prevent economic and cultural national destruction. As cultural and welfare state problems have intensified, it became impossible to dismiss these concerns any longer. However, on rethinking immigration on the basis of the anarcho-capitalist model, it becomes clear to me that a totally privatized country would not have open borders at all. If every piece of land in a country were owned by some person, group, or corporation, this would mean that no immigrant could enter there unless invited to enter and allowed to rent or purchase property. A totally privatized country would be as closed as the particular inhabitants and property owners desire. It seems clear then that the regime of open borders that exists de facto in the U.S. really amounts to a compulsory opening by the central state, the state in charge of all streets and public land areas, and does not genuinely reflect the wishes of the proprietors. And I agree with that. I think that, again, this is why the problem with saying open borders versus closed borders, we're still discussing statist terminology. And this leads me to my book, my essay, The Revolutionary Potential of Illegal Immigrants, from my third book in the Conscious Resistance Trilogy, Manifesto of the Free Humans. And this is a quote from that. One major roadblock in the borders debate is the use of faulty terminology. A valid objection to the concept of public property is the association of the concept with government-controlled property. However, we do not think public property needs to be exclusively thought of as government property. In his essay In Defense of Public Space, libertarian thinker Roderick T. Long discusses the problems with the public and private debate. This is Roderick T. Long that I'm quoting here. When we think of public property, we think of government property, but this has not traditionally been the case. Throughout history, legal doctrine has recognized, alongside property owned by the organized public, that is, the public as organized into a state and represented by government officials, an additional category of property owned by the unorganized public. This was property that the public at large was deemed to have a right of access to, but without any presumption that government would be involved in the matter at all. I have no interest in defending public property in the sense of property belonging to the organized public, i.e. the state. In fact, I do not think government property is public property at all. It is really private property of an agency calling itself the government. What I wish to defend is the idea of property rights inherent in the unorganized public. And I tend to like that idea. What I wrote here was, it seems as if the time has come to abandon terms like open and closed borders in favor of decentralized borders. We imagine a free society with decentralized borders would consist of a mixture of open borders, closed borders, public property, private property, and unowned land. We believe a network of competing public and private spaces which allow for freedom of movement is most consistent with the sovereignty of the individual, which is a phrase that I use in my book. Now, this is not just me and Roderick T. Long. Let's go back to Murray Rothbard from his book, The Ethics of Liberty, where he says, in this libertarian society, however, where the streets would be all privately owned, the entire conflict could be resolved without violating anyone's property rights. For then the owners of the streets would have the right to decide who shall have access to those streets, and they could then keep out undesirables if they so wished. Of course, those street owners who decided to keep out undesirables would have to pay the price, both the actual costs of policing as well as the loss of businesses to the merchants on their streets and the diminished flow of visitors to their homes. Indubitably, in a free society, there would result a diverse pattern of access, with some streets and therefore neighborhoods open to all, and others with varying degrees of restricted access. And it sounds like Rothbard is arguing what I'm arguing for, as well as Roderick T. Long, at least older Rothbard, not old 90s conservative, paleo-conservative Rothbard. I'm not saying that his thoughts on immigration later on don't have a place, but I believe that the younger Rothbard was much more clear here that even with private property, you would have a diverse pattern of access, with some streets and neighborhoods open to all and others with different degrees of restricted access. Now, I'm going to go to another essay by Roderick T. Long. This one here, it's called A Plea for Public Property. He wrote it in 1998. I'll link it below. He says, the main contention of this author is that a society in which all property is private can be as oppressive as the one in which there is only public property. On the contrary, a system that allows networks of private spaces and public spaces to compete against each other offers the greatest scope for individual freedom. And again, that's what I'm saying, is if we're truly talking about a libertarian future that's based on individual freedom and freedom of association and mutual aid and non-aggression principle, we're not just going to have private property everywhere. At least I don't think so. I think that's the more anarcho-capitalist, the right libertarian version. I think just a pure libertarian position says that there would be different types of a mixed use case. And Roderick Long offers this on the fact that there's no perfect answers. He says, ultimately, these problems will have to be resolved by a libertarian legal system through evolving common law precedents. That's fine with me. What I would want to insist on, though, is that some role for public property is important for a libertarian society. An all-private system can be oppressive, just as an all-public one can be. But a system that allows a network of private spaces and public spaces to compete against each other offers the greatest scope for individual freedom. So that's, I think that's what he said there, just said in a different way. And then I went ahead and pulled up a few different other libertarian responses. These are coming from Sheldon Richman, who's another great thinker over at the Libertarian Institute. He just wrote about this earlier this year, January 5th, the right to move, and then more recently, March 1st, immigration in an nth best world. And I'm going to quote from both of those. Of course, these will all be linked. In The Right to Move, he says, so first of all, there's this debate, this discussion that immigrants are just automatically going to vote Democrat, they're going to vote left, progressive, and that's because they're being told, vote for us and we'll give you welfare and all this stuff. And that can be true in some cases, but anybody who spent time in Mexico or Central or South America knows that Catholicism, for one thing, is very big, and that tends to be conservative, and that a lot of immigrants, not even just Hispanic immigrants, Latin immigrants, but from other countries, tend to be very conservative, especially Indian, Middle Eastern immigrants that come to the United States. They tend to stay in their own communities, and they're very conservative, whether right or wrong. I'm just saying. So this assumption that all immigrants are going to vote Democrat is not necessarily true either. And Sheldon Richman says this. He says, quote, seriously though, who can be sure how immigrants will vote in the future, especially if their alternatives include a strong freedom party that welcomes newcomers? Now imagine that. What if the Libertarian Party, not that I support it, or just the Libertarian movement, actually made an effort to, instead of just bad-mouthing and talking down on immigrants, trying to connect with them and understand them? This is what I argued for in the revolutionary potential of illegal immigrants. Let me find it. I said something about a welcoming committee, I think is what I called it, the Agorist Welcoming Committee. So imagine if a collection of freedom cells dedicated themselves to welcoming and allying with incoming immigrants in an effort to help them understand the value of the informal or counter economy. This Agorist Welcoming Committee could help connect immigrants to an underground network of black and gray market services, including access to community health care and untaxed employment. By choosing to relinquish fear-driven xenophobia, we could create a cadre of self-aware immigrant agorists capable of wielding their collective economic power. Individuals are unpredictable, and there's no way of telling how people are going to act or behave once they move someplace new. Perhaps this fear of unknown is what pushes many to make assumptions about strangers. Regardless, we have the power to influence newcomers in our communities, and in the case of immigrants, they are prone to favor counter-economic activity since there are so many legal restrictions preventing them from entering the statist economy. The revolution is in the conversations, and we should seize every opportunity to organize with immigrants to overthrow statist authoritarian borders. So that's kind of my position, and that's what Roderick Long's pointing out. Like, you can assume they're going to vote Democrat, but what if the Libertarian Party did a better job of saying, hey, we're actually the party of immigrants. We can support you. We have positions that you're going to like. Now we get into this collectivism. I think a lot of the arguments Dave has made, this we the people, let's consider what the public wants, are collectivist arguments, and Roderick Long tackles this right here. He says, quote, I can see a collectivist taking this shaky position, but an individualist advocate of self-ownership, a country isn't a home. It's not a country club either. Homes and country clubs are rooted in private property and voluntary contract, but a country is not. The view that a country is owned at all has been the basis of collectivism and tyranny. A property owner may decide he doesn't want someone or some group to enter his property, fine. But what right does he impose his rule? By what right does he impose his rule on other property owners? It does not matter if a majority of property owners and others like his rules. The dissenting minority, individuals with rights, might welcome newcomers as potential employees, tenants, landlords, customers, sellers, friends, romantic partners, or what have you. Majorities shouldn't be able to nullify the rights of dissenters or those of aspiring immigrants. So again, if you're arguing that because some polls say the alleged collective doesn't like immigrants or doesn't want them to come in, so we should shut that down, you're shutting the rights of individuals who live here, who might want to welcome and hire or date or befriend immigrants, and the rights of those immigrants. So even though they're not born in the United States, they still have rights inherent as a human being. Now I'll go to Roderick Long's other essay, Immigration in an Nth Best World. And this is more of that collective argument. He says, quote, if we, in quotes, through the democratic process may shut immigrants out by keeping them off our public property, why can't we make other rules? How about a rule that says if you hold certain political or social views, you can't drive on the roads or use the courts and libraries? Why the distinction between the native-born and the foreign-born? Again, a country is not a country club. Making rules for today's public property requires nuance and reasonableness. There's a difference between excluding drunken, unwashed, screaming people without clothing from the DMV and excluding civil people without government permission papers from the roads and sidewalks. Forbidding homeless people from defecating, urinating, and discarding drug paraphernalia in the public differs from forbidding Americans to hire, sell to, rent to, or live with, and otherwise associate with any peaceful people they choose, regardless of where they're born. And I think that's an important point, Dave, if you made it this far, or anybody, that yes, it's one thing to say, well, I don't want any public property just to be used and having drug users on the street and this and that. But that's one thing. It's a whole different thing to say, as Roderick Long just said, that you're going to exclude free people and say that I can't associate with somebody I want just because they don't have government papers. And now we can go back to David Friedman. This is more of an explicitly open borders position, which again is not what I'm arguing for, but I think he makes a good point here. And then we're done here, guys. He said, quote, "The alternative approach, individualist rather than collectivist, is to argue that since government property was either seized from its rightful owners or bought or built with stolen money, the government does not have the same rights with regard to it that an individual owner has with regard to his property." So again, since government property was seized from its rightful owners or bought or built with stolen money, the government does not have the same rights to it with regard to an individual owner has with his own property. That leaves open the question of what rights individuals have with regard to property claimed by governments. But at least it does not provide the government a blank check to impose any rules that the majority favors on everyone. Open borders do not imply instant citizenship. While there were no restrictions on immigration in the early U.S. history, there were restrictions on naturalization. Such restrictions could be returned in what he calls retained in an open border system. Libertarian theory does not imply that everyone who comes can vote. So he's basically saying, like, look, we can get rid of government restrictions in what he calls an open border situation and still have restrictions on naturalization. You don't necessarily need to say everybody who comes automatically gets to vote, automatically has the same rights as Americans. You can still, within a libertarian context, have some reasonable restrictions and still not be a statist, collectivist, authoritarian. So that's my thoughts on this whole discussion debate. I want to mention that I did find that, and I haven't listened to this yet, I'm going to listen to this today on the bus, that just recently Bob Murphy brought on another gentleman, Simon Genzel. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. He's the author of a book called, or a paper called Public Property and the Libertarian Immigration Debate. He's also discussed this in books and things like that. And he published a libertarian critique of the Hoppian framework. So he might be making some of the same points that I just made. I don't know. I haven't fully watched it yet, but I plan to. And then you can go back and find Dave Smith was debating Spike Cohen, who was formerly the Libertarian vice presidential candidate back in January 2022. So clearly this isn't going away. You can also find, here's another one I just am looking at right now, Dave Smith versus Chris Freeman. I don't know this guy, but I think he's from Cato. What's the ideal immigration policy? Just asking questions. This is on Reason TV just a couple of weeks ago. So clearly these debates are not going anywhere, and libertarians are going to continue to dissect and discuss this for some time to come. And I don't claim to have all the answers. I just know that Dave, putting the whole freaking military on the border is not the answer. Thinking in terms of collectivism is not the answer, and coming up with complicated systems that, like, people need to have an invitation to every single thing they're going to do, otherwise they can't come at all. That doesn't seem libertarian. That doesn't seem freedom. That doesn't seem about promoting individual liberty, freedom of movement, and all these various principles that go along with the libertarian worldview, at least the one that I ascribe to. So those are my thoughts, guys. For those of you who are not libertarian and don't care about this issue, stay tuned for the next video. For those of you who are, please share your thoughts. I want to have a dialogue. Break apart my video. Critique it. Tell me where I'm wrong. I would love to dissect this and continue having this conversation. So I'll remind you guys again, go to theconsciousresistance.com. If you search down here under our categories of anarchism or agorism, you can find a lot more philosophical discussions similar to this one, including past videos I've done on borders and immigration. And with that, I will remind you, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free.